Okay, so good morning to everybody and welcome to this early webinar this Wednesday here. Today we have Lachlan Heisman who will present team dynamics, what does science say? A few house rules before we get started here. So just gonna put that on slideshow here. So as I said, Scrum training is we present team dynamics, what does science say? So this is more of a scientific webinar. Some housekeeping rules while we do this. Try to keep your microphone on mute. If you have questions, write them in the chat. So then we can, I can read them and we can see if Lachlan can answer them. So we'll do that by the end of the session. Yes, and this is being recorded and we will also put it on the website afterwards so you can see it again if there's something you're missing from, you can't remember quite, so you want to see it again. And without further hesitation, I will then hand over to Lachlan.
Oh, something just popped on my screen, which needs to go away. And this is really tricky because I upgraded my, no, this is annoying. I upgraded my computer the other day and what's happened is it said, you can't share your screen anymore. So this is gonna be a fun one for the recording. Oh, here we go. Now it's starting to behave itself. This is what happens when you fiddle with technology, right? So share screen. I know how to do this. Everybody just calm down. How does that work? Can we see the deck? Okay, cool. Well, Jens said it was early in the morning. It's reasonably late at night, possibly past my bedtime in Sydney, in Australia. So I'll try to not use my accent very much so everyone can understand me. And you know, questions you can put up in the chat that will make sense. So my name is Lachlan and I've spent my time doing all sorts of things. I've been a Scrum practitioner for a long time. I did my CSM with a guy named Jens in Sydney. I can't remember, probably best if we don't talk about how long ago that was. And I've been working with Scrum and Agile since then. Nowadays, I spend my time teaching. So I'm a professional Scrum trainer with scrum.org. I do some consulting or coaching, and research is what generally keeps me going. Because I've had this desire to know how things work, and that has led me into the world of teams and how teams behave and what we can say about teams from a scientific perspective. And because I usually train, not getting any kind of feedback is totally freaking me out. So how did I get here and how did I end up being a trainer / researcher? I spent a fair bit of time coaching as a Scrum coach, as an Agile coach, and that led me into the world of study, and I did a master's in coaching psychology at the University of Sydney, and that made me think about how I coach and what guides my coaching. So most of my coaching was based on experience. What worked here, I'd try to use here, and I'd try to use here. And that was good, but I don't know if it was necessarily great. So I was often wondering about how I can deliver a better experience, something that's more reliable to my customers. And I'd see a lot of things like this clearly fake headline of the 10,000 a seat seminar for you know, gift sparks, telling you the 5 steps to guarantee a high-performing self-organizing team. And I was remarkably cynical about that. And I wanted to know, is there something more real that I can use with my customers? So that led me into looking into the research and trying to make sense of that and trying to think about how I can use the empirical evidence to support my customers, which is kind of what I was saying here. Is there empirical evidence that can help me make sense of a situation? So that's why I'm working with a team or an individual, and we're trying to intervene in some ways what's going on, try and improve what's happening. And that made me wonder about, is there something that someone's researched, something that's generalizable that I can do and guide my intervention with that? To be able to do that, I have to know the evidence. So that led me again into the world of science. Okay, so we're going to be talking about teams. So here's a really fun definition of a team. You can see that it is long, and it's very academic in its language, but I'm going to enforce it upon you anyway. It's going a little further than, you know, together everyone achieves more. I think that's the standard one that people use. Anyway, so this is an academic way of thinking about it, which is that a team is a collection of individuals who are interdependent in their tasks, who share responsibility for outcomes, who see themselves and who are seen by others as an intact social entity embedded in one or more larger social systems, and who manage their relationships across the organizational boundaries. Wow, like that's going to roll off the tongue, and you'll be able to just use that in conversation in the future. But there's a few things that I think are worth highlighting in this, and that is when you think of a team, it's worthwhile remembering that it's individuals, it's individual human beings who make up that team. And that means that there could be potential intervention or change that can work at an individual level rather than just looking at the team as a group all the time. Another important thing to remember is that for a team to be effective, they need to be interdependent. So that means that the work done by one person affects the work by someone else. So they need to work together, which creates this shared responsibility for the outcome they need to have together. One thing that a friend of mine used to always say is that teams are about identity, and that is where people see themselves as part of this group and other people see them as part of a group. And identity is how we make sense or meaning in a particular way. So the work of the team is something that helps me make sense of the team. Being as part of that team, I understand why I'm doing something. That's part of my meaning making process. And the other thing to remember with the team is that it's usually sitting inside some other system, which means that there could be influences that come from outside what's going on for them that you could have an effect on, and that has an effect on them. There won't be a test later, so you don't need to remember that, but you can look it up later when you look at the video. Now, another thing that I wanted to focus on was workplace teams. So I'm interested in corporate over healthcare with respect to workplace because I work in corporate environments. That's something that I understand. And I've looked at experimental teams as well, because the advantage of experimental teams is the scientists can test very narrow things, and that can give us information on how to work with teams. So my bias is towards this corporate world. And you might see a lot of people talking about sports teams. So why don't we look at what Manchester United, this amazing team, probably second only to Liverpool, or the All Blacks do? And why isn't that our model for our workplace team? I think one of the most important things to consider is money, in that you know, the average Premier League footballer gets paid £240,000 per month. The top earner is a goalkeeper who gets paid £1.5 million per month. And the All Blacks, who are an amazing rugby union team, well, their captain gets paid about $1 million per year. So we're talking massive high earners, selected from a large pool of people who are fighting to get into these positions, partly because they're so highly regarded, but also we're talking such an elite group, which is not what we get to work with. Though pretty much every company will say we only hire the best. You may not necessarily experience that. Another thing to think about with sports teams is that workplace teams spend most of their time working. So if you're working with a scrum team, they will spend most of the time in their sprint doing work. Wow. Whereas sports teams spend most of their time training. So the local football game that I quite like down here lasts a couple of hours when the game's played, and the rest of the week the teams are training to play that few hours a game. They even have a whole season. They get to spend winter playing that game, and they get to spend summer not playing that game and relaxing, and then starting to train into winter again. We don't have that luxury in the workplace, which makes me very hesitant to look into sports teams. But what about the military? They use teams. Again, though, I think a lot of military teams spend a lot of time training, learning their standard operating procedures, learning whatever they need to do to take part in their exercises they perform. And so that makes me hesitant to look into the military as well. But there are some things I think we can learn, but I'm still not sure, because the military has such a distinct culture and an organizational structure, which is very different from most workplaces. So generally, when I'm looking at the research world, and the research that I'm going to be talking about is drawn from corporate workplaces. So I think that's useful for us if you're an Agile practitioner. So the first thing to consider is this wonderful thing called Tuckman. And has everyone heard of Tuckman? Please, show me some kind of reaction, because as someone who spends most of their time training, I'm drowning here without feedback. I'm getting little ding dongs. No one's going to put a thumbs up in the chat because you're probably having breakfast, right? Because you're kicking back in ISO, living the dream. So this is Tuckman's model for teams, and it's well known partly because it rhymes. Forming, storming, norming, performing, and somehow you can make a journeying rhyme with the rest of it. My accent's wrong for doing that. But this is Tuckman 1965, and Tuckman with a colleague, I can't remember, from 1977. So I'm sure you heard of that. But as someone who's interested in science, I went back and read the original 1965 paper. And this is some of the things that Tuckman said. So he reviewed what was already out there and wrote this up as a review of other people's work, particularly looking at the developmental sequence in small groups. And he had a lot of problems with the research. He didn't like what was there. He said it was anecdotal and subjective, which meant it wasn't very robust in its collection and presentation and consideration. The data was collected post-fact, which means that it was very easy to be biased by the person collecting the data. And I think what's really important for us is most of the data was collected from group therapy. So we're not talking about workplace data. He complained in the 1965 paper that there's a lack of industrial information out there. And even on the back of that, Tuckman still came forward and put forward this nice linear stage model that we work our way through, supposedly. But even with that, he said, you will find that it is not the model is not perfect. Some studies identify some stages, but not all stages. Sometimes two stages have been brought together. Sometimes there's more than the initial 4 stages that he had. Some studies have shown there's a stage that's not even clearly identified in his model. So it's pretty hazy, but you will find this in textbooks and stuff around the place. And this is one of Tuckman's quotes. So generalization. So generalization means how well you can take this model and apply it in different situations. And he said, generalization must be limited to the fact that this has been presented mainly as dealing with the sequential development in therapy groups. That came out well, sorry. So Tuckman's great, according to Tuckman, if you're doing group therapy. If you're not doing group therapy, according to Tuckman, you shouldn't be using it. I'm not even convinced you would be using it in group therapy from the other things that he said. So from a perspective of someone who wants to know what the best thing I can do for my customers, what can I do that's generalizable? What's something that I can do that's reliable or valid to use this sequential model doesn't make sense to me. And talking about it is probably not the right thing to be doing with my customers. So is there an alternative? Is there an alternative that we can say has some reliability or some validity if we are working with teams? Now, there's probably two major ones out there. I'm just going to talk about one of them, which was by Connie Gersick, I think her name was. Gersick is the author. Did some rather elegant studies in the late 80s to the early 90s. And the model that Gersick developed, which is called the Punctuated equilibrium model, sounds very evolutionary, was initially, the initial study was looking at groups in natural settings, and that generated some hypotheses that was then subsequently tested in laboratory settings, which was published after that one. Now, Gersick was looking at how teams that came together to do one job, and it could have been a team that came together for a few days, a team that came together for many months. There were task forces that had to complete one thing. So unlike teams that we're usually used to working with now that produce say product increments every sprint, which means you get to work on the same thing and build up from there, these teams would have one final output that they would create. You can think about it as your university group assignments, those kind of horror stories that you may have experienced. Now, two major findings. One of them was that the groups did not accomplish their work by progressing gradually through a series of universal stages. Dun, dun, dun. So we're not forming, storming, norming, adjoining, conforming, or anything else that rhymes with forming. And the other major finding was that when the groups formed, maintained, and changed their work practices, it was highly congruent between groups. It wasn't in stages, it was in what Gersick refers to as phases. And this is what the model looks like with my incredible sketching ability. So over the length of time that the team is coming together, or the task force is coming together, which is n amount of time, there are two distinct phases, phase one and phase two. That's a pretty exciting name. Doesn't really rhyme. Maybe that could be worked on in the marketing group. So the team comes together for an initial meeting, and that starts phase one. Now, somewhere around about the midpoint in the time, so this is a group that knows they have a deadline. So if it's 6 months, it's somewhere around the 3-month mark. There is a transition, this midpoint transition, which leads into phase two. And then there's the final meeting, and the group presents its thing or delivers its product. So in the initial meeting, the initial meeting is quite an interesting situation, according to Gersick. The research that she did demonstrated that the team can develop working practices within seconds of coming together in this initial meeting. And that can hold the team to those practices throughout phase one, which could be fine and excellent. It could be that during phase one, because of this quick get together, the team is very dynamic and very together, and they really want to go and get the job done and really good quality result. It could be the other end of the spectrum. The team takes a really lazy approach to the work, and there's heaps of time, and there's no worry, and we don't need to rush, and I don't even know why we're having this meeting. And that can be set and locked in with the team very, very quickly as part of that initial meeting. Now, one of the things that Gersick found was that when that group got together, somewhere around the middle point of their time, there was often a reflection on how the teams worked in the first half of their allocated time. Now, the team members might express some degree of urgency about the completion and increase in pace and timelines. And it could create a big transition between phase 1 and phase 2. And that, to some extent, seemed to depend on the amount of external information the group had, as well as how their conversations were carried out at this midpoint. And then phase 2 is the execution of the plans that occurred in the midpoint transition. And that finished with the final meeting when it was finally presented or delivered, or whatever it was they were working on. So Gersick said that these two were phases rather than stages. She was saying that it's a time-based thing rather than an action-based. The model doesn't predict what the groups will be doing or how they'll be doing it between the phases, but said that there seems to be, in the life of these teams, these task forces, a two-phase approach. So the midpoint transition is quite an interesting little point. So somewhere in the midpoint, the team will come together and they may decide that they've completed what they're doing in phase 1, or they may completely abandon phase 1. They might say, well, we really stuffed it up and we should start again. There's usually some expression around urgency to get completed. And across all the groups that Gersick studied, both in their natural environments and the ones that she set up in laboratories, this seemed to occur around about the midpoint. So you don't divide the time in half and find out what happened then, but somewhere around there, this kind of time used and time left seemed to bring focus to the members of the team. Maybe it's the midlife crisis. Maybe it's the moment where the team wonders what they've been doing and it's time to buy the Harley Davidson. So the team would also make new contacts outside the team and listen to what the organisation was saying. So there'd be new information coming to the team, and that would affect how they would work. They could come up with new working agreements, potentially more specific working agreements that would make better use of the time that's left. And it seemed to be that the team members' attention to time was what would trigger this transition. So if the team members weren't paying a great deal of attention to time, well, then they may not actually go through this transition. So some teams would continue phase 2 as phase 1, and that would be disastrous. They would fail if they started phase 1 poorly. Other teams would continue phase 2 after a good phase 1 because they reflect on it and go, we're doing well. But there seemed to be something in the middle there that occurred. So what does this mean? Like I was saying, I'm looking for practices. How can I help my clients? How can you help yours? How can you help the teams you work in? Well, here's something that you can do. So Gersick's findings tell us that you should make your work practices explicit. And that comes from her finding that could be within seconds of the team coming together, that the way the team works together will be set. Which means that if you don't make the practices explicit, then there's all these tacit rules that are established, and they might be dysfunctional. So if you've ever used a working agreement or social contract, depending on what you want to call it, that's a useful thing to do. It will bring that out straight away. You need to deal with interpersonal issues because that's going to be one of the factors that's going to impact how the work practices come together. You want to make sure there's a good flow of information between the team and the context. Remember that a team exists inside a system. So you want to make sure that boundary has information shared across it. So people know what's going on with the team knows what's going on outside there. Now, if you're using Scrum, and if you're not using Scrum, why aren't you using Scrum? But if you're using Scrum, you should be running a sprint review. And the sprint review is a wonderful opportunity where stakeholders come in to review the product increment and the sprint and current business conditions. And then we've got an opportunity to adapt the product backlog based on what's going on. It's a fantastic opportunity to have these conversations and get a good flow of information between what's going on. Now, context is important. So the context of the team, the system they're in will help design the group. It's going to affect the initial meeting and influence the transition from the midpoint. So what I mean by that is that if you're working in an environment that has a certain culture of, yeah, we'll get stuff done when it gets done, then that's going to affect how the group works. If you're working in an environment where you've got availability as a skill set, so if you've got 5 minutes to spare, someone starts a project around you, then that's going to work. So it's going to affect who and how they can interact at that initial meeting. And it's also going to affect information coming in and out of the midpoint transition and how people can operate from that point. If you're a Scrum Master, the midpoint transition is a fantastic opportunity for you to help the team think about what big changes they can make. Now, if you're looking at a release period, multiple sprints, then somewhere around the midpoint is an opportunity to have this discussion in a retrospective. If you're working a single sprint, somewhere around the midpoint of the sprint is the time that the development team will be looking at the Scrum board. Maybe the Scrum Master, you could ask the question, hey, how's it going? How much time have we got left? How do we think we're going? Should we change what we're doing? Maybe that's not your role. Who knows? So Gersick's model, let's have a look at the picture again, gives us an alternative to the Tuckman model that has been used with, was developed with workplace teams in natural environments and experimental environments. It's not like Tuckman, which is focused on anecdotal information on therapy groups. This is about workplace. Now, does it apply to all teams? I don't know. Does it apply to your team? I also don't know. So it's something that we knew applied to many teams, and it was validated across many teams. So I feel like when I'm working with a team, this has a bit of reliability that I can use when I talk with them. So I'll leave that up to you to decide what you're going to do with it. So there's a whole bunch of other interesting stuff out there. So I'm just going to drop a few things in around more recent studies that I've read and thought I would share just because I kind of thought they're interesting. And it also lets me plug a little bit of my research. And before I do that, I need to have a drink. I don't think I've seen any questions pop up in the chat. Is that because everyone is still having breakfast? No? Okay. So here's some interesting, well, I find them interesting. Who am I to say? So team leadership. So strangely enough, teams with leadership perform better than teams without leadership. People have actually studied that. One of the things I love about organizational research is sometimes you get to study the most obvious things, and this was one of them. But there's always buts. It will depend on the kind of leadership and what the team is trying to achieve. This in itself is a topic worth years and years and years of discussion. So I'm just going to drop a couple of things that I find interesting. Servant leadership. You may have heard of servant leadership. Robert Greenleaf kicked off the whole idea with an essay on this. I think it was in the 70s, saying that here we're thinking the leader is someone who's a servant first. They want to serve and they're conscious of their choice to serve, and that will bring them to the point of leading. And what they want to do is see that those who they serve grow as people. So it's an interesting leadership model. It kind of flies in the face of a lot of the ways we understand leadership. We're used to thinking of the great person leader who's pulling us through to greater futures, and it's so exciting. But what can happen with that is that it's all about that person, it's all about that leader. Servant leadership makes it all about the person who is being led. So it should obviate, get us around the problem of the leader who's leading for their own best interest. This is leading for the interests of those who are following. So I was looking at a thing called a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is a study of studies where a whole bunch of people over the years have studied servant leadership, and they've got these results from their study. And then some people brought all those studies together in this thing called a meta-analysis to say, overall, how do these studies relate to each other? And what can we say about servant leadership in a much broader sense? So here they're talking about 138 samples. So that's all these different studies have multiple people in them. So there's hundreds and hundreds of people in this. And they found that servant leadership was positively associated with job performance. How good's that, right? So we've got a bit of a winning thing here. And it's also positively associated with this wonderful thing called employee organizational citizenship behavior. Another thing that just rolls off the tongue. So organizational citizenship behavior is where people are willing to put their own time into the work of the organization that they work for. So it's using your discretionary time rather than the time which you are on the job. So organizational citizenship behavior is shown to have a lot of interesting outcomes in organizations, greater workplace satisfaction, well-being, happiness, that kind of stuff. Anyway, back to servant leadership. Servant leadership is also positively associated with job satisfaction of followers as well. So I'm not just talking about the leadership, I'm talking about the people that they lead, which is great, as well as organizational commitment. People want to work in an organization where the leaders are working as servant leaders, and it's positively associated with follower trust, so that people are willing to trust their leaders more if they're behaving as servant leaders. So if you're a Scrum Master, you're onto a good thing. If you're in an organization which is saying, what is this servant leadership thing? Is it worth it? Should we do it? Well, then yes, you can say, well, I heard that there was a meta-analysis that said, and when they ask you what a meta-analysis is, send them the link to Wikipedia. All my jokes are just coming out of my mouth and getting nothing back. What about shared leadership? So shared leadership is so good that I might even do a PhD. I am doing a PhD on it. This is my topic. So sharing leadership is different to most of our ideas on leadership. Instead of thinking about leadership as something that one person does in a role, shared leadership is where multiple team members at different times will take on leading and following, depending on the situation and depending on the consideration of other people in their team. So it's really useful when the work is quite complex, because when the work is complex, having a single leader may be a limitation to team capability, particularly if you have one person who's somewhat autocratic or a command and control style leader telling everyone what to do. How are they going to know what everyone should be doing in a complex environment? You need to have people with skill, experience and local information helping make that decision. So which means that you want different people taking on the leadership roles. Now it's great for complex environments, and it seems to help teams be more responsive in these environments and more effective at doing what they need to do when things are complex. It also fits nicely, I think, with servant leadership. As a servant leader, you want people to be growing and taking control. Part of that will be to share leadership, helping people do this and step into a leadership role, which is really about influencing the team for their benefit, rather than, it doesn't have to be you on a pedestal, it can be you making the right suggestion at the right time. Now, this isn't just a nice to have. So sharing leadership is shown to have performance benefits, innovation benefits, creativity benefits, satisfaction with the team benefits. So it's a useful thing to start installing within a team. So trust and psychological safety. You probably will have heard people talking about psychological safety being super important for teams and team performance, particularly because Google did it with one of their studies, said that one of the big differentiators between different teams was the psychological safety in those teams. And that is validated not just through Google, it's got robust validation from many studies. Trust is also fundamental to teamwork and really supports how a team behaves, because you're interdependent, you have to have trust. So just two things I want to chuck in here is this definitional idea. What is trust versus what is psychological safety? So trust is where you're vulnerable to the actions of somebody else, which means the action they take can have an effect on you. So if we're interdependent in our work, then what you do will have an effect on my work and potentially my evaluation within an organization. So that means that for a team to work effectively, we have to have this trust. And one recent, again, a meta-analysis that I was reading was showing that trust is incredibly useful in virtual teams and has a strong relationship to virtual team effectiveness. And it seemed to be stronger for virtual teams than for co-located teams. So what we mean by that is if you're going to take some measure of effectiveness in a team and you're looking at a virtual team versus a co-located team, they're saying that trust will have a stronger impact on that effectiveness if the team's virtual. I think that's probably because we can't see each other, which means that I've got to have more trust in you when you're off at home doing your work or in another part of the world. If I don't have that trust, then the teamwork's not going to be as effective. Now, psychological safety is closely related to trust, but it's a different way of thinking about how you work with people. So here we're saying is that in a team that has high psychological safety, is I know that I can take a risk within that team. So my actions are accepted by others. And so trust is about the actions of others. Psychological safety is about my actions. And this is where I can do something different within the team, and it's going to be okay. And so it's my problem. How do you help create psychological safety in a distributed team? That's a really good question. And we might come back to that at the end and see if I can think of something in between. So what's next? Conflict. Team conflict has had a weird and rocky history within teams and team effectiveness, team dynamics. For a while, it was a bad thing, which seemed to make sense. Conflict is a bad thing. And then there were some studies that said it was good. I think the author's name was Jen. I've been wrong before. And that was bad again. And now there's been some more combination studies, meta-analyses again, when they've looked at intra-team conflicts, so conflict within a team rather than conflict between teams. And they were saying, well, the answer is it depends, which is the consulting answer. So here we're saying interpersonal conflict is bad for the team. So that is where team members are not getting on. This is where whenever Lachlan walks into the room, you huff and turn away because you just don't like him. That's what my family's like, but you don't need to know that. Whereas that kind of conflict breaks teams apart and means that you're not going to work interdependently. It's also saying that you're not willing to develop any trust between each other. Collaborative conflict will be good for a team. And this is where we have a conflict on something which is taking the team forward. It's like a conflict on ideas or conflict on the way to work. That is positive for a team. It improves adaptability and improves function of the team. So if you're thinking about conflict, you're thinking about how the conflict is working and what it actually is. So if you're having collaborative conflict, but it's also interpersonal, you need to be able to wind back the interpersonal. If you just got interpersonal conflict, your team will not work. It'll be dysfunctional. And equally, if your team is not challenging themselves or each other on ideas, then you need to bring that into a chain. And there's ways you can play around with doing that bring in a devil's advocate maybe, or use the coloured thinking hats. Who was that? I've forgotten that person's name. One of the other things we do know about conflict is it can arise in teams. You can get interpersonal conflict. And the best way to prepare for that is when there isn't any conflict, which may sound blindingly obvious. But if you expect something like this could happen, it's worthwhile spending some time with the team and say, what are we going to do if we get into this state? And there's lots of material out there by people who are experts in conflict resolution. So you can go and borrow some of their ideas and put that together as a policy for the team, as a social contract for the team, and say we're allowed to call on this if there is going to be, or if there is interpersonal conflict, because that will let you get rid of the interpersonal conflict, get back to collaborative conflict, and actually be a functioning team together. So conflict at the moment is good and bad, and that seems to make sense to me. Oh, what else we got? So goals. Teams need to have a purpose and a goal, but individuals within the team, well, they will have their own goals as well. And if you remember way back at the beginning, and I was talking about what is a team, and a team is made up of individuals. This is one of those scenarios where we think about what's happening with the individual. So sometimes teams with more expertise fail to outperform teams with less expertise. Seems crazy, but it does happen. Now, it could be due to poor communication. So that means they can't collaborate very well. Could be that they don't plan very well. That could happen again. One of the more recent studies said that it could also be due to a weak link team member. And what they meant by that was someone who has a low learning orientation or a high avoidance orientation, or some kind of combination of both. Excuse me. So a learning orientation means that you wanting to learn new things and developing new masteries and new skills. So if you have a high learning orientation, you're always pushing your own boundaries and trying to pick up something new. Now, the opposite of that is low. You don't want to learn anything new. You stay as you are. That can be a problem with high expertise teams and seems to affect their performance. Now, avoid orientation means that you don't want to have an unfavorable evaluation or any kind of negative vibe put towards you. So you're not going to take any risks. You're not going to be out there with the team in any way. So that is going to mean that the team's not going to push forward. It's going to stay in the state they're in, which might impact how they're going to perform. You might be noticing I'm not really completely certain in the language. That's one of the problems with science, is we don't have certainty, but it's also one of the great things about science, which means we've got things to learn. Ooh. So again, if you think about the people in the team that you're working with, are they willing to learn? Are they trying to push themselves in their mastery? If not, have a conversation. Ask them what they want to do. Ask them, what they want to try next. And the same thing with the dangers of unfavorable evaluation, negative attribution, so the avoiding kind of style. Again, that's probably getting down to not being used to having a safe environment or having a psychologically safe environment. And that's something that you should be able to demonstrate if you're in a reasonable position in the team, and to show that you're taking risks and show that it's okay to make mistakes, and that the negative attribution is not something that is going to hit you. Learn how to deal with that, or learn how to actually even better talk about things that went wrong rather than talking about people. Crazy stuff, I know. Okay, one last thing before we look at some questions. This was a very recent study that just tickled my fancy, so I read it. So this the idea that facilitating a group discussion or something seems to be effective for a team. Those of us who experience good facilitation go, yeah, it's pretty good. those who've experienced bad facilitation know that it can be awful. So a recent study used a randomized design. So they had a whole lot of groups working, and they randomly allocated facilitators to those groups. What they found was facilitation had a significant influence on attitude change and the quality of the group, perceived quality of the group discussion. So they've managed to pull out some nice evidence from a randomized group. I think it was teachers who were involved in this, and they said that having facilitation was good. So again, it's a useful thing to bring into your team. Bring facilitation in, bring a facilitator in, bring facilitation skills in. Just one thing, one of the non-meta-analyses. So let me try and pull this together in a way that I hope might make sense to somebody apart from me. And then hopefully we can unmute and we can maybe have a chat. So all the stuff I've talked about. So let's start by thinking about Gersick's punctuated equilibrium model. So perhaps sprint planning is an opportunity as a Scrum Master to help set the tone of the sprint. So if we establish our work practices very quickly as a team, then our sprint planning is a time to think about our next kind of work phase. And if you're the Scrum Master in this environment, you want to be paying attention to how people are talking. Is there a sense of urgency? Is there a desire for quality? Is there a, well, you know, we don't really care so much. We're winding down or something. Pay attention to that. And you might be able to help the team kick through that for some better performance. Again, as a Scrum Master, you watch out for the midpoint of the sprint or release. This is a time where half the time used up, half the time remaining. Is the team getting enough information about how they should be operating? Do they know how they should be working? What's the next thing to do? Maybe you can intervene with that somehow. Again, lead to serve as a team, as the Scrum Master. That's what you're there for, serving the team and the organization, the product owner. But also share that leadership around. It's not all about you as a Scrum Master. Other people have a lot of really good contribution, and you can help bring that in. Demonstrating trust and psychological safety is an incredibly important thing to do. Showing people what it means to develop trust and have trust, showing that you can take risks, and letting people take risks in psychological safety, advising them to, and showing there's no danger in doing that. For conflict-wise, you definitely develop conflict resolution procedures with your team before you're in conflict. If it's not something you're comfortable with, then get some help. That's so important as a Scrum Master. I think my limitations on conflict resolution are very small, and I know people who are very good at it. So those are the people that I would turn to. And of course, be a facilitator. Teams need a facilitator. It's a really useful thing. Facilitate discussions for your team. If it's something that you think you should be involved in the Scrum Master, and bring someone else in to facilitate as well. And that's all I wanted to cover. And I was going to say this evening, but I think for all of you, it's this morning. So thank you. Jens is back.
Well, thank you, Lachlan. We have another question here. So if you could ask this, thank you very much. How do you help create psychological safety in a distributed team, or any team? Because that seems to be, in order to gain that coherence in the team, you need the psychological safety. So are there any tricks how to help that? And particularly what I found in distributed teams is it takes longer to get to know each other, and you don't get these social things you talk about with bonds teams. For instance, if you're sitting together and you're all working in Orlando, for instance, and the team sits together and somebody's buying a house and they ask the other team members, well, do you know any real estate agent I can use? And those social talks that I feel bonds teams doesn't happen in distributed teams. So do you have...
Yeah, I agree with you, and some of that won't happen. So you need to somehow create that. So one of my neighbours, where most of us are still working from home in Sydney. One of my neighbours, we were out walking dogs, and he offered me some mulled wine. We're coming into winter. I know you're not. So I said that, and he said he's practicing for his cocktail making session tomorrow. So Fridays after work, all his team come together and someone teaches everyone else how to make a cocktail. So for them, they're having this social get together in a way that's not related to the work they're doing. And they can start to develop that bond. And again, I would say that's developing a cohesion, which is a little different to psychological safety. So psychological safety is where it's okay for me to take a risk within the team, and there's not going to be repercussions, negative repercussions. So our team has happy hours to get to know each other. It has helped us grow. Oh, cool. Happy hour sounds good. But again, so that's a thing called social cohesion. I didn't talk about cohesion in this talk. So it's a very strong effect within teams is task cohesion, and there's another one called social cohesion. Social cohesion is how well we get to know each other, how much we like each other as a team. That has a strong effect in a team. Task cohesion is that we all know what we're doing and we all agree with what we're doing. And those two things are similarly related, and they both help teams function. So psychological safety is where I can try something out that's different in a team in an attempt to improve what's going on, and know that's an okay thing to do. So I can take risks. And it kind of ties into mastery as well. So I know that if I'm pushing my limit of what I can do and I try a bit harder and I stuff something up, then I know there's like an interpersonal safety net that my manager's not going to come and drag me into a room and yell at me for an hour because I took that risk, because the risk I'm trying to take is to create an advantage. So the question being, how do we create that in a distributed team? I would say it'd be the same as creating it in a local team. It's something that you want to encourage like a small degree of this and get people to be used to it. Potentially having things like happy hours will let us have those interpersonal risks. We may find that there's one person in the team who isn't comfortable with the idea of a happy hour. And you go, well, okay, so how do we then work with that person? So there we're developing psychological safety, because they can say, well, I don't drink alcohol. The idea of a happy hour is a weird thing for me. And everyone can go, well, we can change it into something that makes sense for you. So we're starting to develop those bonds, and we can start to work together differently. It's going to be, I would say, is going to be slower than if we were all together. Because there's times when we're not on a video conferencing thing and we're not seeing each other's faces and so on. So it is going to be trickier. Patience is probably the key to it.
Yeah, and I feel it's that social talk that is missing in distributed teams. So when they do the daily scrum, for instance, it's all work related. There's nothing else happening. And another tendency I see it, they each work on their own user stories, so they're not really swarming or anything like that.
Yeah, so then we're losing our interdependence of our work.
Yes.
So we become parallel workers. That's a bit like people painting a fence. If you give 50 paintbrushes to 50 people and 50 paint pots, they don't need to talk to each other. They just paint their bit of the fence. That's not what we're after.
But I find some techniques to help on that is swarming and pair programming. So they're forced to talk to each other.
Yeah, I think people are doing virtual mob programming now as well.
Mob programming, yeah. And for those of you who doesn't know what mob programming is basically working on one story. Everybody looks at the same screen. So people are working together as a whole team, working on one thing. So you could say it's expanded pair programming.
One thing I like about mob programming is it's not just software engineers do the programming. So because the person doing the programming doesn't they only do what they're told, which means that someone as incompetent as software engineering as I am would be sitting down at the keyboard, and someone highly experienced would be telling me how to do something amazing in Angular. And then I tag out from doing the coding and someone else tags in. That seems to be a very interesting way of getting to know each other too. And also so many other advantages of, learning the code base, establishing reasonable patterns of work, finding out how difficult it is just to do something. If anyone's experienced could you just move that over there? And you go, well, that's going to take me a week. People actually understand why it takes a week. Maybe they'll clean up some technical debt after that. Who knows? There's some interesting stuff on distributed teams. One thing that came to mind, which I didn't mention when I was looking through shared leadership, is part of my set of hypotheses that I'm testing. We're looking at how people work, and I found one paper that said for distributed teams, they've found that women get higher ratings as leaders than men do across the world in distributed teams. So I'm wondering what's going to happen now with post-coronavirus craziness, when anyone thinks back and go, well, it was very annoying that I was working for Lachlan. I should have been working for Nicole. So what are some techniques for conflict resolution? Apart from, I'll bring up the notes. I don't want to go off the top of my head on this because conflict resolution is something that's worth kind of getting right, I think. I always recommend that, as I said, get your conflict resolution rules set up before you get involved in conflict. Here we go. Okay, so you want to be able to avoid it going in. So try not to have individual rewards. Individual rewards seem to create conflict in teams. Weird, hey? Try and ensure the team's working interdependently. Try to get people to talk in a team language, we, us versus I and me. And even though you are not working on individual rewards, you want to acknowledge individual contribution. So people do a great job, you say that's a great job. That's worthwhile doing. So you also want to make sure you've got everyone contributing. So you want to avoid social loafing and minimization of work. One of the things that I found with Scrum, which was originally quite confronting, was using a Scrum board like the one that's behind Jens's head there, where everyone can see all the work that's going on. So there's no hiding, but the advantage of that is we can see what the contribution is and we can start to deal with it quickly before it escalates. So there isn't 3 weeks of Lachlan doing nothing because he hasn't turned up to the status meeting to get his Gantt chart line moved. It's on the board and we can see it. So that's really useful. If you're using it distributedly, you're probably using something like Jira or Trello or something. And that's the same thing. You want to make sure that's all visible to everyone. You want to make sure that you've got good communication channels. So teach people active listening for one thing and use that so people know they're heard and they're being heard. Make sure there's a reasonable trust in the team. You want to try and work together on things as well. So even though we're all distributed, you can still set things up where you can work together. You can share desktops and work together. You can do that over Slack. You can do that, I think, over Teams. So you want to be able to do that and make sure people are working together so they know how to work together. What have we got here? Whoops. I'm just going to go off some notes because, again, I said I don't want to make sure that you get the wrong thing. So, so one of the things I really want to say is that if you don't feel you're appropriate for handling conflict, don't. Get someone in who is. Don't ignore the conflict. it's worthwhile saying, look, there's something here that I think's bad and we probably should get some help. Call up someone from your HR group if you've got that, or someone from outside to come in and deal with it before it gets really nasty. Try and look at whether you can get work responsibilities changed for people. Make sure people know that they're listened to. Often when people are in conflict, they're so busy putting stuff out there that they don't know that it's actually going in. So you've got to be able to show that that's happening. Get people to learn to address issues quickly is another way to get through conflict. Also, one practice is if you've got the trust and the ability to do that, is to get people to describe each other's positions. That's an empathy building process. So if Jens and I are in conflict, then my job is to describe what's going on for Jens to the point where Jens agrees with it. And he says, yes, that's a correct description of what's going on for me. And then Jens describes what's going on for me, and then until I agree with it. And then we've started to develop each other's perspectives. So a bit of empathy can start to get through it. But there are going to be some conflicts that you can't resolve. And in that situation, things will just need to go their separate ways. I've only seen it a few times in my working life. And I think one team I worked with, I said, you just need to break the team up. There's just too much conflict. People need to separate and you need to restart. Usually you can get people through it. I think that people generally want to do the best, but maybe that's my bias.
Okay, thank you, Lachlan. We've run a minute or two over now. This is a very interesting topic. So I will launch a poll now. So if you would be willing to did you enjoy the webinar? Please answer that before you leave. And then we can see. I thought it was excellent to hear these things. It's a difficult science. And I'm very happy you're studying it, Lachlan, because I think it's needed.
I think so. Well, I guess it's from my experience of being out there on the job.
Yeah, we need to know more about these things.
Well, we're getting more and more teamwork oriented, aren't we, across the workforce, not just in the Agile world.
It's all over the place. It's in airplanes. You try to get the pilots and the stewardesses to be the same teams. It's the hospitals. It's. I think this team it's just going to grow more and more. So thank you everybody for attending this webinar. We have many more webinars you can find. We have one on distributed teams by Mark Kilby, which will be coming up in June. So he just recently wrote a book with what's her name? Mrs. Rothman, Johanna Rothman.
Rothman.
They're kind of experts in distributed teams, if you're interested in that. And there are other interesting stuff also. So thank you everybody for coming to this webinar, and I hope to see you another time. Thank you.